Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're continuing our explorations of stories on both page and screen because we have yet another well-known book that's coming back to theaters. In this case, it's part 2. It is Dune. Dune is a very well-known science fiction book that has been told on screen a number of times. And we recently got a very popular movie, part 1 of it, I think about 2 years ago. We have a part 2 of it is going to be releasing right around the time this episode comes out. And I wanted to get Stephen Cox, who is someone who's been on this podcast before, who has a depth of knowledge about this book and a lot of the themes and theories that go into it, and also happens to be my brother-in-law, on to talk with me about it. And the interesting thing about this all is that as I have learned more and more about this, I read the book once a long time ago. I've seen now numerous versions of the movie, and kind of ironically, given that we just did, as I said, another page and screen episode on Frankenstein, forgive me, I've watched too much Mel Brooks, this is yet another story where the book and the understanding of the book does not always match up with the popular culture understanding of it, particularly the way it's presented on screen. And so, Stephen, let me kind of just jump in right with that. This is another story about a hero who goes off to become just like the people who he's trying to liberate and becomes a great hero to them and is a messiah figure, and he leads them to glorious battle, and his eyes turn blue and everyone rides off into the sunset happy because he has taken over and brought justice for everyone. Is that that's certainly seemed to be the popular conception of Dune.
Yeah, Matthew, I'm really glad you started there, because that is kind of my biggest peccadillo with the portrayal of this story in film and the TV miniseries. Is it really does become this kind of white savior. He comes in, he saves the colonized. He's destined for greatness. He's the one. He's the Neo. He's everything. But if you read the books, and by the books, I'm kind of thinking about the original trilogy of books. There's more books beyond that, but the original trilogy taken together is precisely an admonition to beware of that figure. That figure is devastating and destructive, and that charismatic religio-political leader is the worst thing that can happen to humanity.
So the idea that this is just Dances with Shai Hulud is not actually accurate?
Yeah. Although the first book, I mean, that's the thing, is the tone of the first book is strikingly different. Each of the books in the trilogy has a different kind of theme. The first one is religion and destiny. The second one is politics, and the third is prophecy. And you have to kind of take them all three. The second and especially the third books get very, very strange and very, very weird. So to me, it's not particularly surprising that Hollywood hasn't gone there. But it really does a disservice to Herbert and the story itself. It makes it kind of the opposite of what it is.
Right. So let's start with this popular conception of the book. And it's one that I'll admit I even held until not that long ago. I believe actually a conversation with you helped me kind of get started on this, because when the new movie was coming out, I remember saying I wasn't that excited about the story because, to me, granted, I'd read the book once, but I'd probably kind of not given it too much attention. It's a very dense book, and I think it's not what I'd call a page-turner unless you're really into some of the themes. And I was probably at a point in my life where I was not reading it to be a page-turner. Like, I think it's probably a very good book, and I want to go back and read it again. And certainly skim some parts to get ready for today. But as I said, the impression I think that a lot of people have is, it's about this guy who the Harkonnen are treating these people, the Fremen, terribly, and the Atreides in some ways are very similar to the Fremen. They're both getting kicked around by everybody. And so the Atreides go there, and this is largely coming to me from the most recent movie, but, the Duke wants to work with the Fremen and partner with them and help give them a better life instead of just instead of just ruling over them as slaves the way the Harkonnen did. And as I thought about that story, and granted, I think a lot of it was, people writing about the story and talking about it, and the stories kind of take on meaning in themselves in the way that it's, Mandela effect told down it again and again, it became this great example of why one people saying that they're going to liberate another just never works. That you cannot, as colonizers, liberate the colonized. They have to do it themselves. And you can support that and certainly get out of the way of it. But that, from what I'm hearing from you, is very much not the story of the book, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I shouldn't plant too firm a flag on that, because it's a little more complicated. I do think that if the book, and just thinking about the first book, has a weakness, it is a little bit that the Fremen don't get the screen time, or like the page time, I guess, that they maybe deserve. But even as there is a little bit of that, that lack of agency as they're kind of led by Muad'Dib, by Paul Atreides, like they are treated with respect and with strength. They're fully fleshed out. They're three-dimensional. They do have agency, although we don't see it a lot. I think in terms of planting the seeds in the first book of that theme, a lot of it is kind of really like rooted in Middle Eastern history. I think Herbert was not only, I mean, look, the book's Orientalist, like that. There's just no getting around that. But Herbert was very respectful of Middle East culture and Middle Eastern history. He clearly had people he was talking to, not just books he was reading, but colleagues and friends he was talking to who were familiar with the culture and with the history. And
let me just interrupt you there for a second, because I think you're starting to answer a question that I wanted to get into, which is that, this is a book about a people who are considered more primitive to the kind of first worlder types, again, using these terms in quotes, who live in a desert area and have control of a resource that the rest of the universe needs for transportation. So this is very much supposed to be a metaphor for Saudi Arabia, like the Middle East, and oil, correct? Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to read it now without thinking that. I think maybe Herbert was thinking a little more classical history than that. I think in terms of when we think about jihad, the theme of jihad is really, really strong. That's what the first book is about this coming jihad.
Now, again, I don't mean to keep interrupting you, but because you're using terms that I think a lot of the audience may not know, or I think for most people, when they hear the word jihad, well, if you're a certain kind of geek, you think of Vampire the Masquerade, but mostly you probably think about the word that is used to describe what is described in the West as acts of Islamic terrorism. Now, I know that word is not that, and I'm sure you don't mean it as that. I can't say, though, I know exactly what it should be defined as. So one of the reasons why we're bringing Stephen here on is he is also an expert in Middle Eastern history and concepts like that. Talk a bit about what the word jihad means and what you think Herbert means by it.
Yeah, so by the way, in the 2021 film, I think they replaced jihad with crusade, which, like, it's kind of inevitable because Americans have this inescapable association of the word. But in Islam, jihad just means struggle. And over the centuries, it has generally come to mean a struggle for liberation. There's an internal struggle for liberation. There's an external struggle for liberation. And so anti-colonial movements in the Middle East were often couched as jihad. And I think that really gets at what Herbert is talking about. That's how he means it. He means it in the way that most Muslims, when he's writing in the 60s and 70s, most Muslims would have thought of it or most Middle Easterners anyway, would have thought of it in those terms, in those liberatory terms. Western audiences, especially American audiences, really just don't think of it that way. And so it's really got a lot of baggage to it. But I do think I do think that's what he was going for.
Okay. And so, because that's the idea, is that there is this, and I think it's also further helpful, is that we're using the word messianic quite often. That's a word that in popular culture today is associated explicitly with Christianity, but all three of the Abrahamic religions have a concept of Messiah to some extent. Judaism, at least Temple Judaism, thousands of years ago, very much did. Many parts of Judaism today have moved away from it. Some parts still are waiting for a Messiah. There's an agreement that Jesus was not that Messiah. Christianity obviously believes that that Jesus was the Messiah. And Islam also does have some messianic ideas that are different sects of Islam hold to more or less. But again, this is not an exact parallel to Islam by any means. But talk about the... Go ahead.
Yeah, so I one of the interesting things... So in Dune, Paul Atreides is referred to as the Mahdi, which is the Islamic Messiah. And especially in Shi'ism, there's a chain of Mahdis. And the kind of prevalent thread of Twelver Shi'ism has that this Mahdi has been hidden, occluded from us, but will come back. And I think that's the tradition that Herbert is drawing from, because, oh gosh, I should have looked this up. The 12th Imam, the Mahdi, died under the Abbasid Caliphate during the Middle Ages, and that's when he went into occlusion. But very similar to Paul Atreides, the Mahdi in Dune, his father was a leader of the Banu Hashim clan, a leader of a very highly respected family. He actually was the 11th Imam, the 11th Messiah. And arguably he was killed by the Caliph, just as in the book and film, Paul's father Leto was very popular, rivaled the emperor, was killed by the emperor's steeds. So I think that parallel is just right out.
Okay. So because I didn't realize that they're actually using Islamic words, or they're actually using Arabic words to discuss similar ideas here.
Yeah, he sometimes tries to obfuscate the Arabic terms that he's using, like, and my Arabic is terrible now, but I don't think like muad'dib or lisan al-ghaib, like I don't think a lot of these terms quite translate. But Mahdi for sure, and jihad, I think he's using just spot on.
Interesting. Okay. So that's sort of the public. And so again, yeah, the idea of the white, blue-eyed person who runs this, I can see now again why we're getting into some critiques here. So what do you think Herbert is actually trying to say about this idea of the Muad'Dib who comes along and as an outworlder comes along to be more Fremen than the Fremen and to lead them to glorious victory? Because also, again, in the popular culture understandings, the movies, and if you've just read book one, it ends with them just liberating the Fremen, right? It's not going beyond that.
In the first book, they liberate the Fremen, but then at the very end, Muad'Dib marries the Princess Irulan and becomes the new emperor.
Right.
So, spoilers for the end of part 2. They win at the end. The Fremen are liberated, through their struggle and through Paul's, and then book 2 is kind of about the emperorship of Paul Muad'Dib, and he becomes this tyrant. Through the spice, he, we can get into all the, he kind of combines, this is another kind of theme of the book, is this kind of gender essentialism. He kind of combines what Herbert considers like the masculine and the feminine, logic and intuition, the mentat and the Bene Gesserit, and becomes kind of more than both of them. And he has this incredible prescience that makes his rule kind of impossible to resist. And that's when we start to see this liberatory figure, this this colonial, anti-colonial white savior. Is he? Isn't he? Like, become exactly what I think Herbert, who himself was fairly libertarian and right-leaning, would have considered. This is what happens with charismatic leaders. This is what happens when the colonized and the colonial combine forces to overcome that system. Because I think one of the complications of the white savior narrative is that in anti-colonial movements, it is often kind of a blurry distinction. A lot of times these anti-colonial movements aren't maybe led by a white savior, but often are led by indigenous folks who have been brought up within that system and are part of that system. Right. And it's that combination of colonial and anti-colonial forces turned against the system that has produced some of the strongest anti-colonial movements. Right.
Because you have to, both literally and figuratively, you often have to speak in a language that the colonialists will understand.
Right. And Muad'Dib speaks all the language. He does it all. He's Neo. He's the one. He can do all of it, and his rule becomes this combination of sort of hegemony as gained through his prescience and his kind of all-knowing status, and also repression, because the Fremen go from being this really put down, struggling group to being the feared imperial army. They overtake the Sardaukar as this tyrannical police force in the galaxy.
Right. Which, given that in the early parts of the story, at least as I understand it in the book, and certainly in the movies, they present themselves very much as, we don't want to have any part in all of your imperial struggles. We just wish you would leave us alone and honor our world and honor our worms and all of this. It feels like it's a real betrayal of what they had claimed to originally want.
Yeah, and in that case, in that sense, I think the figure of Stilgar is really important to that, because his evolution kind of, in a way, mirrors Paul's. And he in a book that could really give more page time and agency to the Fremen, Stilgar becomes this kind of stand-in where we watch that transition take place.
Would it be fair to say then that this is that the first book is kind of the Paul Atreides villain origin story? I mean, is he straight up presented as a villain, or is he more of like a Macbeth figure, like a tragic, a tragic? He's not really a hero, I guess, but the person who has had everything go wrong and.
Oh, that is interesting. I think you could read it both ways. Paul sees the jihad coming, and he's actually trying to prevent it. He's trying to avert this destruction that he sees in the future, and clearly becomes instead the avenue of it.
Now, when you talk about that, do you mean, for the Fremen, is the jihad the struggle to liberate Dune, or is the struggle to then go out and become the new Sardaukar and become the new Imperial Strike Force?
Unclear to me at least. Early, it's spoken of very much in terms of the liberation of Arrakis, but kind of a simplistic reading of Islamic history, which maybe Herbert is doing here. It goes from liberation to look, we just kick everyone's ass. We could just take everything.
Right. I can see that. I definitely have heard that version of Islamic history, often from right-wing folks, of like, what started as the fight to liberate Mecca and Medina becomes, the Islamic, conquest of all of North Africa and up to, what's now Bosnia and Serbia and things like that. So I can see where that comes from.
It makes me think there's a medieval Islamic or Middle Eastern writer named Ibn Khaldun who traveled a lot around at the time the caliphate in the Muslim world, and he talked about that within Middle Eastern history, this give and take between the city and the edge, the center and the hinterland, and he even saw Middle Eastern history as characterized by these periodic. You had these settled cities, these settled empires, Rome, Persia, and then you've got somebody on the periphery who starts off liberating themselves and then finds that it's actually quite easy to go ahead and just take that imperial place. And so you could argue that the Arab armies did that. You could argue that the Turks did that. You could argue that the Mongols did that. It's a trope. I don't subscribe to it, but it's a trope that is very, very popular in looking at history.
Yeah, I can see that. And am I also right that in the book, like Herbert, again, the popular conception you'd seem to be that Herbert likes Messiah stories. This at least I did get from reading the book, but I don't think you get as much from the movies and TV shows, though I do have hope that this most recent version is going to go deeper into this. But my memory is specifically in the book that there's a lot of evidence actually that the Bene Gesserit planted the seeds of this prophecy. They basically kind of created a self-fulfilling prophecy of, oh, you should believe that one day a person will do X, Y, and Z, and then you should follow that person so that much later they could have a person who is X, Y, and Z. Because that now feels very critical of religion and specifically critical of this idea. Not even just that the Fremen are wrong, but that the Fremen were have basically been not quite mind controlled, but have been so deeply manipulated. For anyone who watches Babylon 5, it's very much kind of like the Vorlons do there, of teaching people to think that you are the creatures of mythology so that when you come to them, they will listen to you. Am I getting that right? Is that actually kind of more what the Bene Gesserit are in the books?
Yeah. Oh, man. I'm so glad. Okay, so you're talking about the Missionaria Protectiva, right?
Right.
This is the Bene Gesserit order of, witches, however you want to refer to them, send out missionaries of sorts to every corner of the galaxy to plant stories, because they are looking, they're through their genetic manipulation, they're on their own quest for the Messiah. They're trying to breed the Messiah, and they're trying to make every corner of the galaxy safe for that person when they arise. Mm. And so this Kwisatz Haderach is planted all over in different stories. And so by the time Paul comes to Arrakis, they've already got this well fleshed out mythology about his coming, which I think is, I don't want to say it's my favorite part. I think it's one of the more interesting colonial aspects of the story. I think it's fascinating, the way that mythology, the way that kind of long-term, you're right, it's not brainwash, that long-term just planting of the seeds of ideas and seeing where they sprout, as a way of control, as a way of, you can control through it's a deep winning
level,
hearts.
Yeah, it's a deep level cultural manipulation of convincing people that there's some sort of outside mystical force that this person is then fulfilling the prophecy of, when really you just told them that this prophecy would happen so that later you could intentionally fulfill that.
Yes, but it takes root because it speaks to something, it's like they say that, cultures all over the world have a flood myth, similar to like Noah. It fulfills a cultural need. And for the Fremen, that need is their genuine subjugation. Like they do need that hope that comes with the idea that the Mahdi is coming.
Right. And so what is the Bene Gesserit goal? Like you said that for them it's not totally made up, though. They also believe this person, I think it's called the Kwisatz Haderach. Is that how you say it?
I always thought it was Kwisatz Haderach.
Kwisatz Haderach. So what is their conception of this person?
Their conception of this person is, if memory serves, it's really not too different from the role that Paul ends up fulfilling, except that they were hoping that it would be someone under their control.
Right.
And, they have kind of been for thousands of years a parallel power structure to the Padishah Emperor. And for the long-term survival and thriving of the human race, they have been kind of breeding bloodlines. There's a lot of biological determinism in this book, and they've been trying to combine bloodlines to create someone who can combine that masculine and feminine aspect and become kind of the Bene Gesserit that's greater than the Emperor.
So on some level, they're kind of looking for like the Plato's Republic idea of like that there's going to be the benevolent prince, that they very much want authoritarianism, but they want there to be like the one perfect person who will rule with perfect authority and justice and that kind of thing, but also, as you said, under their control.
Yeah, and in the book, I don't think it comes through quite in the movie very well, but in the book, Lady Jessica gets a lot of flack for letting herself give birth to a son, because that wasn't the plan. The plan was she was going to give birth to a daughter. They were going to pair that daughter with someone else, and then that person was going to be, hopefully, the Kwisatz Haderach.
Right.
And by giving birth to a son who is not under Bene Gesserit control, Jessica's, in fact, Jessica gets so, like, I think in the movie, Jessica gets such short shrift because in the book, she's such a pivotal character, and in the movie, she just kind of, like, sweats and, needs her hands together a lot. But
even then, in both movies, she does have a confrontation with the, I want to say the Mother Superior. I don't think that's the exact title, but with the head of the Bene Gesserit, who says you're supposed to have a daughter. This is your arrogance, etc.
Yeah, and that really, really screwed up their plans.
Right. Okay.
And in the second book, the Bene Gesserit are actually, they become part of the resistance against Paul's rule.
Interesting. Okay. And so as part of that, like, there are some science fiction worlds where there are human-like people living on multiple planets, but we're never supposed to think that they're all like descendants of Earth. Like in Star Wars, there's no Earth. But am I correct that in the Dune world, we are supposed to think that these are actual human beings, that there was an Earth at some point, and therefore all of these planets are colonists who eventually... Because part of what I'm getting at is, are the Fremen a literal different species who just are very humanoid? Or is the idea that, like, the humans, the Fremen, the Harkonnens, the Atreides, all of these people can trace their origins if they go far, 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 far back enough to the humans on Earth?
I believe so. I think... the way that Star Wars takes place, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, this takes place in our galaxy, but a long time from now. Kind of so that whatever we would recognize as our species is deep in the mists of time. Right. And so folks like the Fremen are not native per se to Arrakis, but they've been there so long,
right,
that they might as well be.
Yeah, I mean, which, you know, if you think about other native peoples, like, yeah, humans did, as far as we know, did not independently develop in the Americas. They developed, all of us, you know, came from Africa, but a group of peoples came to the Americas thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, and then 500 years ago, Europeans started to come here. And so we say those people are indigenous, and that's really what indigeneity means, is that...
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly the parallel.
Okay, that makes sense. So given all this, why do you think it is that the story is so often misremembered? And that many of the tellings of it seem to lose a lot of this nuance and complexity?
Boy, I mean, Hollywood does love its own kind of, call it Messiah, call it white savior, you know, like... We love our Neos. We love our Luke Skywalkers.
Yeah.
Hollywood loves to make those films. A film about Luke Skywalker becoming, well, I was going to say becoming Darth Vader, but Anakin kind of does. But the idea that this person who we invest all of our hope in becoming the most nightmarish thing possible is... I think maybe just less appealing.
Yeah. I mean, look at, like, Last Jedi is one of my favorite Star Wars movies, but it's widely... it is by no means hated by a majority of Star Wars fans. There's a minority, but a very loud minority, that very much doesn't like it. And one of their biggest reasons is because they want Luke Skywalker to be this hero and not a morally complex character. And yeah, I find that comparison particularly humorous, because I would then say that one of the best evidences of how misunderstood the story of Dune is in popular culture is when people who will say, oh, A New Hope is just a ripoff of the Dune story. When, from what you're saying, it actually sounds like Dune is more of a critique of the kind of stories that A New Hope is.
Yeah. I think, you know, George Lucas... I don't even think George Lucas kind of thought it through that deeply, you know? I think he wanted to tell a hero's journey. And that's really not what Dune is.
Right. Like, is there a hero that emerges as kind of the main POV character to oppose Paul? Or is it much more just a story of this is the brokenness of power and of politics and of religion?
You know, it's been some time since I've read the second and third books, but I do think there's various characters. Chani, who becomes Paul Atreides' wife and the Empress, it kind of fills that role to some extent. I think Duncan Idaho, who, spoiler alert, is brought back in the second book, kind of becomes that figure. Like, there are these kind of moral compasses that you can latch onto, but there's no one anti-hero, which is maybe the point.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's a very kind of like complex, nuanced narrative that just in general doesn't translate to screen very well. You know, we were talking about exactly this in a recent episode that we did about Frankenstein, where I hadn't actually fully read the book of Frankenstein until the last couple weeks, and was amazed at how incredibly different it is of every instance of Frank. Like, I knew enough to know that the point is that Dr. Frankenstein is the monster, not the monster that he creates, and that it's very much supposed to be a critique of scientific ethics and all that kind of thing. But realizing, like, you know, there's no Igor, there's no lightning, the monster is incredibly eloquent. You know, when he speaks, it's not just the raw kind of thing, you know, it's so very different than everything from, you know, the Bela Lugosi movies to, you know, every Frankenstein episode that every TV show has ever done. And it sounds like Dune is kind of a similar thing.
Yeah. I saw saw someone online complaining, someone on the right kind of complaining about this revisionism of Frankenstein as the put upon victim, and it's like that's the book. That's what the book is.
Yeah. Yeah. Even the fact that we call the monster Frankenstein, when that's the name of the doctor.
The creature. I mean, his name's Adam, right?
In the book, he's never really given a name. He kind of refers to him as Frankenstein's Adam, but he often calls him a monster. And yeah, I think we wrestled with what to call him because we don't want to call him a monster, but that's how it is Dr. Frankenstein's narrative, and so that's how he frames the creature.
Interesting.
But yeah, it's very much an Adam kind of a story with an attempt to create an Eve is a big part of the book. So pulling it back to Dune then, so you saw the movie that came out a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah.
I rewatched the movie just a couple of hours ago, and I think I missed this the first time I watched it, in part because I think it's a beautiful movie and it's a very slow movie, and so I probably was not paying as much attention as I should have been. And this time I was kind of like doing things while having it on, which in a weird way allowed me to concentrate on it more. But the point of all that being, and so maybe it's because of all that, or maybe it's because I have now come to understand a lot of the stuff that you and I have been talking about before we recorded even, but also been talking about it with others. It does feel like this first movie, not only is Paul feeling very reluctant, but there's a lot more that makes me hopeful that maybe this movie isn't going that same direction in part two, that they are actually trying to say there's something wrong with this whole culture of, hero worship and them immediately being like, oh, you're the most Fremen that's ever Fremen to Fremen. What's your feeling? Like, did the first movie strike you as yet another, we just see Paul as a hero and we're not muddying those waters, or did it seem like there's some real potential to get into this nuance?
I am hopeful. I am hopeful that we can get there. The way that his visions of the crusade played out, it did look like he was, not feeling very conflicted about it, mm-hmm. And maybe this is cynical of me, but I think the fact that Chani is played by Zendaya, who is just such an enormous star, mm-hmm. I think she's hopefully going to get the agency and mm-hmm. the role that character really deserves and almost never gets, and that could be a really good way. I do think, like, culturally, maybe we are ready for that complication.
I hope so.
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of reasons, both cynical and optimistic, to hope that part two really delivers that.
Yeah, I would really love to see that. And I have my own cynicism, in part because, like, from a cinematic perspective, your hero riding into battle on a 500-foot-long death worm, surrounded by his loyal fighters fighting against the Harkonnen, who are presented as, evil McEvil pants. It's hard to think that's going to be anything but badass, and that you're not going to look at that and go, yeah, go Paul, go Paul. And so wanting to both morally complexify that's not a word, but you know what I mean, while at the same time also being like, yeah, but it looks pretty badass, doesn't it? Like, I'm not sure how that can be done, but I think it's possible, and I would love to see if and especially because I do think that movies can do a good thing where the movie does make you feel something and then later tries to make you feel bad about feeling that. And I'm being kind of facetious there. I don't mean it in quite those terms, but like, I could see that if early in the movie we do think this is really badass, and then if later the moral complexity and nuance is really kind of hammered home, then we have to even sit in the theaters and think, wow, maybe when I was cheering on, Paul leading his army, I should have been more aware of the problematicness of it.
Yes. And I think, the characters of Stilgar and Chani are the ones who are going to provide that, if anything. Like they're so perfectly placed to, look at Paul and
Yeah.
and see what he's doing and start to question it and give voice to that for the audience.
Right. So we had a lot to say about this, and I want to kind of let you have some follow-up last things to say, but I want to this kind of last question I want to ask you. And again, this is kind of trying to look into an author's intent, and so I don't know how much you've read it, but it does seem like you know a good deal about Herbert. I'm thinking about, like, what is he trying to say here? Particularly because, and like, as our world right now proves, like, we still have in many parts of this country and many parts of this world very, very negative views of anything that Middle Eastern peoples are doing for what they might understand as a freedom fight, and which isn't a blanket endorsement of all of it, but also is critiquing the blanket critique. But certainly even more so in 1965, like, it was almost unheard of in the United States, at least, to be questioning anything except Israel good, Syria, Egypt, all these other places bad. And we'd fought a big war there's a big war in 1956. We're coming up on the big war in 1960, and another big war in 1967. 2 years before this book, 2 years after this book is published. My point being, do you have the sense that Herbert was specifically critiquing Islam and messianic ideas within Islam and sort of the religiosity of Islamic freedom fighting movements, and maybe it was those, maybe it could be also, this is when Malcolm X, Nation of Islam, and all those are also big figures. Is it more that, or is it more, this is a critique of messianic ideas and sort of like holy wars in all of these religions, but that couching it as in a culture that would ring bells of, Eastern Orientalism type things, as you were saying, is a safer way to tell the story than making it more explicitly about all kinds of holy war ideology?
I think there's a couple things going on with Herbert there. I don't think he's singling Islam out.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's trying to present an exotic other world, and he's doing so in a way that, like, today we would not probably consider like the way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think he's critiquing Islam specifically. I think he's critiquing power. I think it goes really more to his view about politics rather than his view of religion. Religion just becomes this conduit for manipulating people, but I think the actual critique of his story is about government power.
Right. That makes sense. That certainly makes sense. And while granted, religion did not have the overt political power in the United States that it does today. This is before the forming of the moral majority or any of the other things that will then eventually lead to, the Christian evangelical political movements of today. Certainly still Christianity had a lot of political power, and religion had power in places all over the world, often to great, terrible effect.
The biggest lie that liberals ever told is that the West is secular and the East is, a combination of religion and politics.
Right.
It's entirely, and religion is suffused in our politics.
Yeah, always has been. So we're gonna have some bonus content for our members in just a few minutes, specifically about like hopes for the second movie that's coming. But any other last things you want to say in terms of just like helping people better understand the story in ways that the pop culture discussions and the movies up till this most recent one. I say movies. There's the David Lynch movie, and then there's the Netflix TV show, are the two main ones that I know of. But I think it's also been kind of like told, in as a Dune type story and many other things. But in all of these, like, are there any other kind of last points you want to bring up?
The thing that I think is most interesting, and it plays out in several ways, like both across the first book and across the trilogy, is the tension between like consent of the governed and repression. And, so in the first book, the Harkonnens are described as tyrannical, as dominating the Fremen, and I think the portrayal of the Harkonnens in the 2021 movie is so much better than in the 1984 version.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Harkonnen are given their fair due. Like, they are brilliant, they are conniving, they are ruthless and brutal, but they're not silly like they kind of come off in the 1984 version.
Yeah, they're not hot air balloons.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So you see that, you as you said, like Duke Leto talking about cultivating desert power. Kind of what he's talking about is, instead of dominating the Fremen, winning hearts and minds,
right,
and gaining hegemony. And I love that interplay, and how kind of by the end of the book they both come together in the figure of Paul Muad'Dib, who is both the winner of hearts and minds and the dominator. And then throughout the rest of the trilogy, you watch his winning of hearts and minds continually degrade into just a pure domination.
Right. Which I think is I'll say another piece of historical context that I think is really important here is this is coming out in the 1960s, where basically this is the last decade of the British Empire and the French Empire, and a lot of the former European colonies, especially in Africa and Asia, are getting their freedom for the first time, and so I think, there's another really interesting aspect of the story there that's being commented on.
Yeah, it's an anti-colonial story, but without the happy ending.
Yeah. Well,
and I think in a lot of ways, Herbert might have been looking at a lot of the anti-colonial movements of the 60s and 70s, and what ended up happening as anti-colonial groups become the rulers of their now independent country, and lose the hearts and minds of the people and rule increasingly through domination.
Yeah,
he probably was looking at a lot of those examples and seeing what he wanted to do with this.
Yeah, I think in terms of anti-colonial theory, that's something that's often talked about a lot, is that, like, one of the worst parts of creating a situation where the only way that a oppressed people can find liberation is through armed struggle is you're now meaning that the government of the newly, that there's now an armed force that has won freedom, and that is very difficult to translate into. And a lot of the scholarly work, particularly that's been done by South Africans, especially Black South Africans, has talked a lot about this, is that and that Nelson Mandela especially, who we often forget was an armed freedom fighter who committed a number of acts that we think of now as, yes, they were, fighting an evil regime of apartheid, but, quote unquote, quote unquote innocent civilians were often killed by his actions, and they were described absolutely at the time as terrorism, and would be, by the definitions many people use today. I think it's a word that's, grossly misunderstood and misused and hypocritically used, but that in South Africa, the ability for it to be a peaceful and democratic transition out of apartheid, instead of just the defeat of the apartheid government militarily, changed a lot. And I'm very much there. I don't want to get too into direct politics, but to be very clear, I'm not using that to say, so therefore oppressed people should never use violence to fight back. I'm saying, when all other options are cut off, I understand why violence is the option, and I don't think I can critique that. I'm saying it's a good reason for us to stop using violence to oppress people. But now we're getting way off in other ideas. But yeah, no, I think that's helpful, especially when we think about this is a book that is now, 58 years old, and we're telling it with a fundamentally different understanding of colonialism and of white supremacy and of white savior ideas and things like that. And so it makes sense that the story is continuing to evolve and change in how we see it. And I will say the best result to me of this conversation with you and which also the last couple of days is that I'm much more excited to see part 2 of the movie, and ready to be very disappointed, but also ready to be really impressed.
Yeah, me. I'm hoping that they can stick the landing and give us a more complicated Neo figure. I mean, I think I'm probably going to enjoy it anyway. Part 1 was just so beautifully shot.
Mm-hmm.
That score by Hans Zimmer is just, I mean, the movie is just a joy to watch. And I'll certainly have my critiques, but
yeah,
I plan on enjoying.
Well, and we'll definitely get you back. I'm going to make sure I've read all 3 books, and we're going to get you back to discuss them afterwards, especially with some other Dune scholars. Rob McKenzie, who's been a frequent guest on this podcast, is a big, big fan of Dune and knows the books very well. So I'm hoping the 3 of us can get back on, as well as maybe some other folks. So we'll do a lot more of this. Steve, for those who don't know you, do you have any published works that people can find? Or is there stuff that people can be like, hey, this Steve Cox person has some good ideas. I want to see what I can look at.
I'm entirely under the radar. I have no social media. I've got nothing for anybody. Sorry.
Okay. The doctoral thesis has not yet. I should be referring to you as Dr. Cox, shouldn't I?
Yeah. It's still under quarantine for another year.
Okay. That then you get the right. It's because it's owned by the university right now, and then you get the right to publish it.
Yeah. It. If you want to dive for it, you can look for it next year. It's actually on the anti-colonial movement in Egypt and the role that the Muslim Brotherhood played in it.
Nice. Yeah, well, very, very relevant stuff. So thank you so much, Steve. If you want to hear more of Steve, just if you become a member, you can then get the full episode. We're going to do some bonus content about some more specific hopes for the upcoming movie. If you're not a member already, it's just $5 a month, $55 a year. You get ad-free content. You get bonus content at the end of like 95% of the episodes. We are going to start doing members-only content. We've started doing that already on Star Wars. We're going to start doing that on Superhero Ethics as well. And more than anything, membership also just helps support us, keep the lights on. So please think about becoming a member. If you are a member, stick around for the bonus content. For everybody else, we have spoken.